Hi YouTube, how are you doing today? So basically I want to go over something that I recently just read. I read the book in Dr. Carl Hart's High Price. It's a book about reevaluating how we see illegal substances in our society. He's a Columbia University professor in psychology and neuroscience, and he shows a lot of evidence on how our drug laws do not reflect, the drug policy does not reflect actual science about how these drugs interact with us and our bodies and the actual health effects they cause. So in the last chapter of the book, he gives us some guidelines to use when we look at drug news in the media, such as different studies. So the four things he points out, and I'm paraphrasing them so I'm not using his exact words, are the route of administration of a drug, the dosage of that drug, tolerance, whether or not the person who's getting the drug, is given the drug, has tolerance towards it, and what social background they come from. So to start, I just want to go over each one of these four sorry about that, and break them down so you can use it more practically. Because we always come across the news where we hear a new study shows X effect from drug Y. And so what we need to do is ask four basic questions related to these four topics every time we see the story. Because if we don't, we won't understand it. Because these four factors are huge when it comes to the actual interpretation of what the effects mean. So let's go through it all on a quick basis, right? So we'll use a common drug that lots of people use, alcohol. So first would be route of administration. So most of us drink our alcohol, but unbeknownst to many, there are other routes of taking in the ethanol chemical so you can alter your minds and get drunk, such as vaporization or rectally. Yes, I said it, rectally. Don't try this at home. So coffee is much in the same way. You can take caffeine orally, or you can inject it, or you can sniff it, and you can inject alcohol too. And depending on how you take in the drug into your body, it produces dramatic effects, different effects, some of them can be very dramatic, such as intravenous or smoked forms, because it's immediate access to your brain, while something like oral absorption takes a while, as it has to pass through the stomach and whatnot. By the way, I'm sorry I'm on the side here of the video, but I have no choice. So when we see a study about a drug, and we need to know how did they administer the drug to those subjects or those participants in the study. So for instance, if we hear that caffeine, 2 doses of caffeine, let's say a study said caffeine can cause vomiting, right? And you realize, well, okay, you just took it at that, and you walk away instead of asking, hey, how do they give the people the caffeine? Okay, so here's a better example. I'm sorry about that. Let's say they say the dose of 1 cup of coffee causes extreme feelings of agitation. And then you may be surprised. How can a cup of coffee's worth of caffeine cause these kinds of effects? And when you realize, oh no, they injected them with that same 100 milligram dose you take orally, and now they're bouncing off the walls. So this much is the same thing with many other drugs. So when you hear a study on MDMA, and you hear that it causes holes in your brain, but you find out, wait, they gave it to monkeys intravenously, and people almost never do it that way in the real world, humans. So where most people take it orally and some may sniff it. So that goes for route of administration. Basically, you need to ask yourself, how was the drug taken into the person's body in the study? And remember, oral doses, oral absorption is probably the safest mode of absorption, followed by rectal, nasal, and then intravenous. And there are other ones in there as well that I'm not going to go over, such as subcutaneous and buccal. Lip, that's the skin and lip, inside the lip, respectively. So now we move on to dosage. Dosage is basically self-evident. Most of you can probably guess that it just deals with how much of a drug has been taken. So there's an old saying that goes, the difference between a drug and the difference between medicine and poison is dosage. So for instance, we all need vitamin A to survive. But if we take too much vitamin A, we can go blind. So, or die. So, as you can see, something that's essential to our lives can kill us if we take too much, such as water. If you drink a gallon or two of water in one sitting, you will cause your brain to swell, and you will bleed out of your ears, I believe. So, when we hear that certain drug cause certain effects in a study, in a scientific study, we need to look at, okay, what was the dosage? How much did they get? And how many times did they get it? Was it one single time? Was it a few times? Was it a huge dose? And you can see again how these all play into each other, how this plays into route of administration. So if we can tie these two together, we would say, was it a huge dose given intravenously, or a small dose given orally, or anywhere in between, right? So dosage is crucial. So when we hear a drug, MDMA caused heart failure, we need to ask how much was the dose, and we find that, well, if most people take 100 milligrams, and you gave this monkey over 2 grams of it, how is that realistic? Or to go back to alcohol. If we hear one drink of alcohol kills someone, we need to ask how much did they drink in that one drink? How concentrated was it? And we realize, it was pure Everclear, and it was a big 24-ounce glass. Everclear being 95% alcohol, 190 proof, I believe. Yeah, 190 proof. So it's very important to remember how much of the drug did they take. So let's now move on to tolerance. Now tolerance basically deals with whether or not the people who are getting the drug in that scientific study have experience with the drug itself and taking it. So for instance, someone who is new to alcohol versus someone who's experienced with alcohol, their reaction to one shot is very different. A person who's new to alcohol may feel that a shot inebriates them significantly, while a person who is more acclimated to alcohol may feel that the single shot is barely effective on their mind. So tolerance is, again, a huge issue, and let's tie it all together. If a person who's been taking a certain drug for a long time takes a small dose at orally, they may not feel much of an effect, versus if they were to take it at a large dose intravenously. So all this is very important. When we hear that people in the study took a drug, for instance, like cannabis, marijuana, and they had a horrible driving score, or or a short-term memory score, we need to ask, are they experienced with it? Because there have been studies, And Dr. Cole Hart has done some of them, which show that people with tolerance to certain drugs do not experience the same cognitive defects or slowing down, for instance, with weed or cannabis, as people who've been doing it for a long time, or people who have been doing it recently. So what I mean to say there is that people who take drugs longer don't get as many negative side effects behaviorally from them. I'm not talking about long-term effects like cancer and stuff, but behaviorally. Like a person who drinks alcohol regularly feels less impairment than someone who does it infrequently. So when we hear of a study where people were taking a drug and they've got certain effects that may or may not be good, we need to ask, do they have experience with the drug? So to tie all these, so I already tied it. So finally, I want to get to social background. You see the sun setting. I thought that would be a cool effect. The beginning of the video is bright. Alright, let me get to this. So the social background is actually very important, probably the most interesting one here. One that's probably a little counterintuitive, doesn't seem to fit in with the others. Briefly, there was a study done in the 1970s or early 1980s where an experimenter had two groups of rats and each gave them morphine. One group of rats were born and raised in a kind of social environment where they can interact with other rats and play around and mate and whatnot, while the other group of rats were raised in isolation, unable to mate or play around or even interact with any other rats. And then they gave these rats doses of morphine, and they found that for the rats that were raised in the social environment, they would use the morphine very infrequently, if at all, and it wouldn't really obstruct their normal day-to-day activities. They wouldn't become hopelessly addicted pressing that lever like we would think. However, the rats that were born and raised in isolation did experience what we think of the cliche of hitting the lever and having the dose repeatedly given over and over until the rat dies. So amazingly, because some rats were born in a social group where they can have relationships and maybe we can say some kinds of responsibilities in that world, that although they still had the same effect from the drug, they felt as if they didn't want to ruin what they had. They had something to go back to. Whereas the caged rats had nothing to begin with, because rats are very social animals, and in that depression, the only thing that gives them a bit of relief is the morphine, and so they do that until they die, because nothing else makes sense to them. It's somewhat cruel to raise them in that way, but it needs to be done in order to understand nature and whatnot. So the researcher who did this, he said, has a quote in the study where it says, addiction depends on whether or not you see the world as your cage or as your park. Park being the rats raised in the social environment, because he called it rat park. So if you see the world as your park, you're more likely not to be addicted. While if you are raised in isolation, or if you feel as if the world's your cage, and you don't have much relationships or whatnot, then addiction is much more likely. And so social background is, again, important. So we need to, if we want to tie it all back, let's tie it with alcohol. If a person who is drinking alcohol, right, he's taking it orally, he's dosing a lot, he has a big tolerance, but let's say one of them has a social background where they have good responsibilities and they feel not to break them, while the other has no real social responsibilities and is, we would say, has no grounding in anything, doesn't have a job or anything, or doesn't have a very good job that can support them sufficiently. So in that situation, we would see that the person with the social background can have their effects of addiction become mitigated for them. Mitigated meaning kind of hold it back. While the other one who has nothing to hold that back with, no other kind of place to get good feelings from, basically, can fall into addiction much easier. So as you can see, this is much, most people believe if you just take any drug, anyway, you'll get addiction, certainly, depending on what it is, right? And that's completely untrue, or that, all these things matter. So, we can't just hear that some drug did something in some study and just take it like that without asking these 4 fundamental questions. That's where we could actually become more critical of the media and the way they portray and represent these substances. It's also part of the fight in drug legalization and reform, and drug policy reform. Just like Terence McKenna said, in this society they don't hand out rights to people. Certain marginalized groups have to earn those rights and fight for them. Black people didn't get rights handed to them. They had to fight. They had to not become violent, but stand their ground and organize. And same thing with the gay movement and the women too. They all had to organize. No one was just handing it out to them. They had to fight for it. So, knowing how to evaluate these studies in the media is very important. To give a quick example of one that came out recently, back about a year ago, in March of 2014 or so, spring 2014, there was a study that said that even casual cannabis use can cause brain deformations. And so what we find is that they had no idea how these people were taking the drugs. It was just they took them off the street. We have no idea what their dosage is like. We have no idea, we do have an idea what their tolerance was like, but we had no idea what their social background was like. And on top of that, there was other problems with it, such as a really small sample size of only 20 people, and the fact that they didn't screen them for other drugs. And there's no way of knowing if other substances could have inflicted on them, because there was no test before they started smoking. So, something like that needs to be critically evaluated and shown for what it is, complete bullshit. We have to remember that many of these studies are funded by the government, and they always want to look for a negative outcome because that's the intention of the study. As much as we want to think that science is mostly a free enterprise where people are objectively evaluating results, it's not true, sadly, especially when the person who's paying for your research wants a certain outcome, and if you don't deliver, you're not going to get money anymore. So, for instance, in many studies on cannabis, we don't know how they took it. Some of them may vape it, some of them may eat it, some of them may smoke it. We don't know how much they're taking because it's not standardized. We don't know, the cannabis market outside of Colorado and Washington is very. It's like the meat market before 1903 and the book The Jungle. We don't know how much of a tolerance they have developed, and we never ask whether or not they come from a certain social background which is isolating or inclusive. So we're almost at the 20-minute mark here, and I feel like I've covered all bases pretty sufficiently. This is drug science in the news, and this is what you need to know about it. So whenever you hear study, and they're talking about some kind of scientific experiment or treatment they did, and with some drug, and it came out with some effect, you need to ask these 4 questions. How did they administer the drug to the person? How much of the drug did they give to the person? Does the person have a history of using the drug? And what kind of social background does the person come from? It's only after asking these 4 questions, and some others that I may cover in some future videos, that we can finally start to dismantle the propaganda from the facts. So I want to thank you all for listening. I want to apologize for the lack of light, but I thought it was kind of cool. and some probably hear you the table and microphone effects. So thank you very much. I try to make this 20 minutes. Alright, so thank you for listening, and have a good one.